Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the Genshin Impact 5.8 Phase 2 banner review. Mualani is getting a rerun, Chasca is getting a rerun. They're being run alongside Bennett, Ororon, and Aoife, and we have one hell of a weapon banner. There's a lot to say about these banners, so let's just get right into it. Let's talk about Mualani. Mualani is probably the worst good character in the game. Mualani is a character that, just numbers-wise, is fairly strong. Nothing, like, crazy, but is pretty good. That being said, the fact that she doesn't have access to buffs to her main stat scaling, right? She's an HP scaling character, and she doesn't really have access to HP percent or flat HP buffs from the rest of the party. The only HP buffs we have from party members are like 5-star constellations. And on top of that, a lot of her good weapons, like Witsith, don't give her any HP. That creates a scenario where the amount of stats that you gain from one roll of crit versus one roll of HP is actually pretty similar. In other words, let's say you have a build that has a total of 25 useful substat rolls. Usually, you have, let's say, 20 crit rolls and 5 attack rolls on an attack scaling character. You probably have another build lying around that has like 2 or 3 less crit rolls for like 4 or 5 more attack rolls, but it won't actually be better than your current build because while attack rolls on those other characters are good, they're not as good as the crit rolls. For Mualani, those alternative builds will be better, which creates a scenario where Mualani ends up in her optimal build having a higher total amount of substats. With the same resin investment, she ends up getting more substats. That's one of the many factors that makes Mualani kind of an interesting character. On top of that, her damage is fairly front-loaded. Those two factors together make her one of the better free-to-play speedrunners. And then an additional factor is that, well, she's a catalyst, so Witsith. And Witsith, when you get the right buff, is really, really powerful. But then the problems start to rear their ugly heads. There's a lot of problems with Mualani. There's the obvious ones and the less obvious ones. So obvious ones, the auto-targeting is often kind of cooked. The pufferfish that she spawns after doing her chomp sometimes just disappears. I've had it fall off of the abyss floor once. The stack generation for her chomps, right? When Mualani uses her skill, she generates up to 3 stacks, and at 3 stacks is when you want to use a chomp. The way it's coded is kind of finicky, and sometimes it just doesn't work. But if you wait until after you see the 3rd stack getting generated, it slows down your hits, and sometimes because you're slowed down, your buffs are going to fall off. So if you want to play Mualani optimally, you have to like remember the right timing and use it as soon as possible. But if there's a slight issue with a finicky coding and you don't get the stack, you end up with a 2 stack instead of a 3 stack, and her damage just falls completely. Mualani often struggles to run competent healers in her teams. She can use Shilonen, but in a lot of the teams that run Shilonen, it's hard to slot in your Shilonen burst, because if you're playing what the default Mualani team is right now, which is Mualani, Shilonen, Sucrose, Pyro, with a Pyro slot being fairly flexible, or this doesn't have to be Sucrose and can be another Anemo. You apply Hydro, then you crystallize it for Cinder City or Petro or whatever, and Shilonen Shred, and then you swirl it with Sucrose. But if you apply Hydro, then swap to Shilonen and use both her skill and her burst, you won't have Hydro on the enemy anymore, and then you won't be able to swirl it. And you'll have to swap back to Mualani, which makes your setup longer, but more importantly, if you have Witsith, which procs your Witsith and makes it so that you then have to swap to Sucrose, then Pyro MC, then back to Mualani, and you're only going to get 1 chomp with Witsith uptime, and the rest is going to be after the Witsith buff expires. And so being put in situations where you have to use Shilonen's burst, where you have to heal, over your setup so much. Which makes it so that despite Mualani being an HP scaler, which has a fairly large HP pool, she is actually one of the characters that dies in combat more often. It's not as bad if you don't use Witsith, right? If you're a Battle Pass player and you use Sack Jade, or if you use the craftable weapon, or if you end up going for her Sig, obviously. But for free-to-play players that want to get their clears on difficult content, Witsith is so much better than the free-to-play that you kind of just have to take the L. And the way you're actually supposed to do it is you have to make sure that you only use Shilonen's burst on rotations where Witsith is on cooldown, because you only proc Witsith every other rotation. So you want to use the Shilonen burst on a rotation where it doesn't f you over to use it, basically. Other than that, though, there's even more potential problems, right? A lot of your pyro applicators have some problems. They're either long cooldowns, which force you into longer rotations, or slow application, which makes you kind of have to hold off on your chomps a little bit, or all they do is pyro application, and it feels kind of bad to use a character that isn't buffing your Mualani at all. Other than that, right, it's also possible for enemies to dodge your pyro application if they move, and unless you're playing the really fast applicator like Xiangling with her burst, if an enemy ever dodges an application, you are completely cooked, because you'll apply Hydro on them, and then you need to apply Pyro 3 times by your next chomp to remove the Hydro and reapply Pyro. You need to apply Pyro twice to remove the Hydro. Then there's also the possibility of your Pyro applicator's uptime being too long, and you still apply Pyro after your uptime is over, but then you need to reapply Hydro so you can crystallize and swirl it, so you kind of just have to wait until your Pyro application is over. A lot of the Pyro applicators are also RNG reliant, right? If you do Pyro MC or Dea, you want to use them on Sac, and Sac is not 100% to proc even at R5. There's a lot of things, basically. But if you're willing to deal with all of those issues, Mualani is a character that performs fairly well. On top of that, Mualani is a character that has fairly strong early constellations, as well as a fairly powerful signature weapon. That, paired with her ability to front load her damage and her ability to cheat out more total stats than other characters, makes her a very strong, like, dolphin character. Or I guess a shark character. Get it? The biggest problem with Mualani right now is that with the current... I feel like I say this every video nowadays, but with the current power creep trend, I don't know how competitive Mualani will be with characters like 4 or 5 patches from now. The early calcs on Nodcry characters seem to indicate that the baseline for Nodcry carries is higher than the baseline for Natlan carries. If you look at the sort of DPS you could expect from Natlan carries in 5.0 versus Nodcry carries in 6.0, the Nodcry carries are like 10 to 20k DPS higher. Now, the Natlan carries got better as 5.x progressed because they got more options. So they're not 10 to 20k ahead of current Natlan carry teams, but most likely will get characters that synergize with the Nodcry carries. And so their teams will likely get stronger. And will Mualani be able to keep up with that? I don't know. I think the main deciding factor for whether Mualani will stay very powerful and very relevant in the meta going forward is going to be Durin. We've already had indicators that Durin is going to be a pyro support, and we don't know exactly what Durin is going to do. But as I mentioned earlier, Mualani right now, her biggest problem is that last slot. It's the pyro slot. The last slot options from Mualani are so bad that whales find themselves using Hu Tao for pyro application. It's not the best one, but Hu Tao does give 12% crit rate, and her skill cooldown is 60, which makes it easier to make it work in those shorter rotations when you compare it to characters like Mawika with the 18-second cooldown, or Pyro MC with the 18-second cooldown as well. It's not going to be as good as using Xiangling, but Guoba is just so hard to make work with Mualani properly. And so some whales are actually do use Hu Tao for their clears. Anyways, outside of just like balance stuff altogether, there's another important factor, I think, which is the way in which carries function in Stygian Onslaught. There's 2 main factors. 1, their boss matchups, and 2, their team building. Team building is pretty straightforward. It's when you look at the characters they work with, is it characters that other strong carries want? From Mualani, Shilonen, Sucrose, Pyro. Shilonen is a somewhat contested unit, but she's generally replaceable in teams where she's good. So it's not too big of a deal. Sucrose, right now, isn't too contested, but when Flints comes out, she'll be a lot more contested. But if you don't have Sucrose available, or if you don't have her at all, or if you just don't want to use her, the other animal options are usable, right? They're not completely dysfunctional, they're just not necessarily as good. And you can also do something like Candace, and it works. You can use 3-star Sucrose Heizo or 3-star Sucrose Kazuha, and it works. And then the Pyro slot, well, none of them is all that good, but that also means that it doesn't really matter which one you use. Which means that for the team building aspect, things are looking alright. She's not too demanding in terms of her supports. And the second aspect is boss matchups. And it's really weird to say, or it's really difficult to say for Mualani because honestly, she's being shilled right now. But what exactly describes Mualani? She's low frequency damage, so she's gonna work against bosses like Turtle. She's hydro damage. She's multiplicative reaction, right? Vape damage. The fact that the main thing that enables her is a pyro aura gives her a little bit of flexibility in team building, where you can either go for the traditional Hilonen PV pyro, or you can go for a burning team with her. So she's also going to be able to work against the bosses that favor burning or just high frequency damage in general because of burning. So she can be good against bosses that favor low frequency like Turtle, or high frequency like, I mean, I guess Papilla, like last Siege and Onslaught's Lava Dragon. Overall, I'd say that her boss matchups are okay. The fact that every single one of her teams is a vape team does mean that there are certain bosses that are just completely unplayable for her. Any boss that has an innate aura that isn't pyro, completely cooked for Mualani. I mean, technically, if the innate aura is Dendril, you're fine. Any boss that heavily relies on you triggering a specific reaction that doesn't fit well is going to be pretty rough, right? If we look at the upcoming bosses, Mualani will be unplayable against both the Batui and the Crab boss, but she'll be alright against the Drake, though not necessarily that amazing. So I'd say that Mualani right now, she's an okay character. Her long-term value is, like I said, going to be dependent on Durin, but as of now, she's a fairly strong character. For new players, getting Mualani can be nice because her teams can function with very little pulls on your account. You can make a functional Mualani team with Mualani, Gangling, Bennett, Kachina if you want, I guess. And sure, Kachina's kind of dog shit, but it's a team that functions. If you get one copy of Candace, you can use her. If you get one copy of Sucrose, you can use her. And a team like this will be fairly functional. And it also has the upside of, if you're a very new player, you want to get a powerful team as quickly as possible. If you just want to build the strongest team for, I don't know, Neuvillette, you're going to need to get Neuvillette, and then you're going to have to wait for a Farina banner. If you want to make the strongest team for Mualani, you'll get way more out of getting a Constellation or a Sig on Mualani than out of getting Shiloden or any other specific 5-star. So if all you want is a powerful team as quickly as possible, she's a pretty good character for new accounts. Next is Chasca. Chasca is a character that doesn't really have that ability to cheat out more damage like Mualani does, but unlike Mualani, she's a lot more versatile and she's pretty much guaranteed to stay somewhat meta relevant in the future, because so long as they release off-fielders that do damage, having an on-fielder that can equip the VV set is gonna be alright. And she's by far the best VV holder if you don't want to be putting VV on a support, if you want to be putting VV on a carry. Chasca's overall damage isn't that bad, but it's not particularly outstanding. But she has the ability to be played in a lot of different teams. You can play her wherever you want. It rewards you playing non-Animo Dendro or Geo elements, right? So Pyro, Hydro, Electro, Cryo. But it doesn't favor any single one of them all that much. The damage is split in between a lot of different numbers, so it doesn't heavily favor the multiplicative reactions, right? The Pyro, Cryo, Hydro, like Vape and Melt stuff, but it does benefit from it. And so you end up with a lot of options for her teams. The cost of that versatility is damage. Realistically, compared to the other Natlan carries, Chasca's damage is generally a bit lower. That being said, Chasca also has some pretty powerful constellations, so if you're the sort of player who wants to go all in on one character, getting Chasca with cons is gonna make you have a carry that can be used against pretty much any boss. Pretty much anything except the turtle. Personally, I still wouldn't necessarily recommend going for Chasca. I think she's a kind of whatever character, but like if you really like her, she is definitely a very usable carry. Next, we have our 4-star characters. Let's start with Aoife, because he's the worst one here by far. Aoife is budget Sucrose number 37. Aoife isn't good. Aoife's kit is basically designed around being a on-field animal character that has healing. He's supposed to be favoring Electro Charge and Swirl. Pretty much the same thing as Mizuki, but with Electro Charge on top of the Swirl. But the problem is, the buffs that he gives to Electro Charge and Swirl aren't really better than the buffs you get to Electro Charge and Swirl from getting the EM buff from Sucrose. And unlike Sucrose, you can't really swap out of him at will because he's got his Night Soul state that he wants to get into, and he goes in the air when he's in his Night Soul state. He does have healing, which is nice, but the healing is honestly pathetic. It's not good healing. It technically does enable Farina, but the unfortunate reality is that the direction they're going with taser teams right now is with Lunar Charge. And Lunar Charge does not benefit from damage percent, so enabling Farina is actually pretty worthless. Like, his kit directly is designed around Swirl and Electro Charge, is designed around those reactions, not around the talent damage. But the main upside he has over the alternative, which is Sucrose, is his ability to heal, which enables Farina's fanfare to be generated. But the fanfare doesn't buff those reactions, so it's just kind of pathetic. On top of that, his healing before C6 is honestly so awful. The C6 significantly helps his healing, and it's kind of hard for him to break even on healing with Farina's HP consumption without the C6. At the end of the day, Aoife is still a Catalyst animal character, so you can always just use him as your VV if you don't own the other VVs yet because you're a new account, or if they're busy somewhere else. It's okay. It works. It is what it is. Next is Ororon. Ororon, like, is directly designed around Electro Charge. His Ascension passive makes him generate Night Soul points when you hit enemies with Hydro or Electro with other party members. And then it makes it use up those Night Soul points to deal damage when you trigger Electro Charge or Lunar Charge. But it also gets Night Soul from triggering Night Soul Burst, and it also uses up that Night Soul from dealing Night Soul aligned damage. Honestly, in taser teams, Ororon is kind of dog shit. Like, he's not bad, but he's incredibly replaceable. He's really not doing too much. And the taser teams generally, outside of the Inefa ones, are kind of not that good damage-wise. So Ororon is a functional second Electro slot in your taser teams, but he's far from necessary, and you can just use Fischl, really. Nowadays, Ororon's relevance in the meta is a lot more in non-Electro Charge teams with Mualani characters. Ororon's ability to apply off-field Electro makes him work as the Electro slot in a Shadow team, and his ability to enter Night Soul Blessing allows him to use the Mualani support set, Inner City. On top of that, his C6 gives your on-fielder an attack buff, and honestly, more importantly, all of his damage is Night Soul aligned. And the nice thing about Night Soul aligned damage is that there's some bosses that actively benefit from you having that. Ororon is pretty good at breaking Void Shields. He's not the best because you won't trigger his Ascension passive against Void Shields because you need to deal damage in those teams to trigger it. But he is pretty good at it nonetheless because his burst hits fairly quickly. And his burst is Night Soul aligned. On top of that, he's an Outline character, so he generates Night Soul, which can generate Fighting Spirit from Aoika. But yeah, so overall, that's honestly what Ororon's main role is nowadays. But you can also use him with Chasca. Ororon is also technically usable with Nevidet, although he's pretty much outclassed in every way by Inefa. I'd say that Ororon nowadays is the sort of character that's good to have, and his constellations are good to have, but not because of any of them outside of C6. It's pretty much just the C6. But it's not as big of a deal as you might think. Like, 30% attack is nice, but it's not actually 30% attack. It's up to 30% attack, but you gain it fairly slowly. So in practice, it's more like 20%, and it's all right. Like, that's a support set, that's a TOM or a noblesse, but it's not an insane deal. He's not the sort of character that you're too happy to see on banner, but you're not unhappy to see it either. And then finally, we have the GOAT. We have Bennett. Bennett has always been an insanely strong character. I'd say that right now, he's objectively top 2, and whether he's number 1 or not is going to depend on who you ask. The trend that characters have followed lately is they have made carries have larger and larger motion value numbers, as well as access to self buffs that are not attack percent in their kit and artifact sets. And that's created a scenario where, because the numbers from the carries are getting bigger and bigger, you gain more and more from stat buffs. And because Bennett's attack buff is the best in the game, Bennett just keeps gaining value compared to characters who only provide off-field damage or a mix of off-field damage and buff, but the buff is lower. I'd say that in the Sumeru meta, honestly, he probably wasn't even top 5 because the attack scaling carries that we had back then were just a lot worse and there was a lot less flexibility. I think at the time, the strongest 4-star was just Singso by far. And we only really started getting actually strong attack scaling characters in Fontaine, right? Where we got Lenny, Navia, we got Arlecchino. If you want to push it a little bit, you could say Risley, but yeah. And then it's kept up in Natlan where we got Kanich, we got Chasca, we got Malika. We got Veressa, but Veressa doesn't really love Bennett and neither does Kurt, but still. Like, Bennett has always been a very strong unit, but he wasn't an important part of the best teams you could make, nearly to the same extent back in the Sumeru meta or before that, as he has been lately. Right now, Bennett is definitely one of the best units in the game. He's very, very good. If you don't have him, you're kind of cooked for a lot of teams, so getting at least one copy of it is nice. I think people often heavily overestimate the importance of Bennett's constellations. Bennett only has 3 constellations. He has C1, C5, and C6. The C1 makes it so that he always gets the attack buff. By default, he only gets the attack buff when he's not healing, so when you're above 70%. But honestly, unless you're playing like a complete idiot, you should still be getting good uptime on your attack buff even without the C1, unless you're playing Arlecchino, basically. And so the main part of this is actually the 20% attack buff, which is nice. Then C5 is 3 burst levels, which is a little bit less than 20% if I remember correctly. The 13-1, yeah, it's 18%. And then C6, it gives you a pyro infusion, and it gives you 15% pyro damage. It says that sword, claymore, and polearm characters gain 15% pyro damage. That's not true. It's actually everyone gains 15% pyro damage, but only sword, claymore, and polearm characters get infused with pyro. Bennett's constellations are good, and honestly, the biggest reason they matter is because everyone uses Bennett. And so getting the cons on Bennett is going to be somewhat impactful for pretty much every account. However, none of them are really necessary. So as long as you get your Bennett, you're honestly fine. Overall, I would say that these banners are pretty solid for new players, right? If you don't have Bennett yet, getting Bennett is good. Getting Mualani early on is pretty nice because she works well with characters given for free. Aoife is at least going to be of hope Sucrose until you get her. Ororon can be nice to have. It's okay. But getting cons on Aoife, I mean, whatever. Getting cons on Ororon can be nice, but it's whatever. Getting cons on Bennett isn't necessary once you have him. So going deep on this banner isn't that great. If you're an older player, you probably already have the Bennett cons you want. You probably don't care about Aoife cons, and Ororon cons can be alright. So this is probably a better than average early banner into an account, and a pretty average banner for non-early players. This is a bit worse than that, because Chasca is not quite as valuable in my opinion. Now let's talk about this. First, Mualani's Sig. Mualani's Sig, when you just compare it to Whitsith on the good rotation with Whitsith buff and with the right Whitsith buff, isn't that much better. But Whitsith is 50% uptime, and one of the 3 buffs is completely worthless. Which means that unless you're playing in content that you can kill in one rotation, right? So in Abyss, Whitsith is good enough. But in Siege and Onslaught, where content is designed around you taking like actually 5-6 rotations to clear it, Surf's Up makes a much bigger difference. So what about Astral Vultures? Well, what about Chasca's Sig? Chasca's Sig on Chasca is quite good, but also pretty good stat stick on Linny. Like, if you want to use it on other bow characters, like on Fischl, for example, it's not going to be very good because the attack buff is conditional on triggering Swirl, and the charge attack buff doesn't help. So it's not the best, like, just general bow stat stick, but it is actually quite good on the bow user carries we have right now. So it's I'd say, a fairly average weapon to lose a 50-50 to if you're not actively looking for it. And then we've got this lineup. We have Flower Wreathed Feathers, which is honestly probably the worst weapon here. It's an alright weapon for charge attack users, but it's not that amazing. It's just okay. Then we have Wave Riding Whirl, which is kind of an interesting one. At R5, you get 40% HP, and then another 48% HP if you have 2 Hydro characters, or just another 24 if you only have 1 other Hydro character. It's an ER weapon. Initially, I thought it was going to be good on Navidad because I didn't realize there was a 15-second cooldown. The 15-second cooldown kind of makes this it's dog shit on Nibinet. You don't really proc this at the right time in his rotation. This is pretty much just a Mualani weapon right now. The ER isn't the best stat, but it's not bad either. ER isn't a stat that you actively want to go out of your way to get on Mualani, but if you end up with ER, it can end up bringing you to being able to use your burst every rotation instead of every other rotation. And if that's the case, then obviously it's good. Generally, it's not worth building a lot of ER just for that, but if you get 60 from your weapon, and it's a weapon that also gives you the offensive stats you want, then that's alright. And if you get the 48 and the 40, that's 88% HP, which is, well, a lot. When you compare it to her free-to-play option, the default one, right, the Ring of Yaksha, is a 41% HP and 32 damage percent. However, Mualani is a character on which HP Goblet is actually viable, so damage percent and HP percent can basically be converted 1-to-1. So this is basically 32 plus 41, alright, so 73 HP. Wait, we're adding World at R5 is 88, and 60% additional ER on top of that. So just compared to the free-to-play option, it's a lot better, but only at high refine. Wave Riding Whirl doesn't give Mualani any of her offensive stats from the substats, it's all just from the passive, which means that offensively, it gives you double the amount at R5 that it does at R1. Basically, Wave Riding Whirl is the sort of weapon that's kind of shitty to get generally, but if you end up getting a lot of copies of it, you're happy to see it. The problem is, when it's on the banner with Surf's Up, it's kind of stupid because, like, if you go deep enough on the banner to get R5 Wave Riding Whirl, you're probably deep enough to get Surf's Up too. So it kind of feels dumb. Anyways, these are the two worst weapons on the banner here. Now let's talk about the bangers. Fruitful Hook. Fruitful Hook at R5, 32 plunge attack crit rate, 32 plunge attack damage percent, high base attack substat. This is best in SWAT on Claymore plungers. It's better than the 5-star weapons because there is no 5-star signature on a plunged Claymore character. All we have is just stat sticks, and this is just more stats than the 5-star stat sticks give you. At low refine, it's not as good, but it's still not that far behind the 5 stars because it's just such a good weapon overall. Compared to Serpent Spine, it refines better than Serpent Spine does. So at R1, it's pretty similar to R1 Serpent Spine, but at R5, it's better than R5 Serpent Spine. But unlike Serpent Spine, you don't have to deal with having to wait for the stacks. All in all, if you're a Gaming player or if you're a Diluc player, Fruitful Hook is a pretty appealing weapon to get. But I don't think it's worth actively going for because I feel like they probably will give us a Claymore Plunger at some point, and when we do, we'll get a signature for that. And finally, we've got the two best 4-star weapons in the game, Fav Sword and Fav Lance. Fav weapons just in general, like inherently, are incredibly broken. What makes Fav Sword and Fav Lance better than the other Fav weapons is just the amount of sword and polearm characters that care about using Favonius. If you look at Catalyst characters, you've got a decent amount that can use Favonius, but you have other support weapons, TTDS. And the existence of TTDS makes it so that Fav Codex is a lot worse because a lot of the characters that could use Fav Codex will want something else. For bow users, there's a bit more of them, but either they're not that good or you don't play too many of them at the same time. And because you get a Favonius Warbow for free from completing the Mondstadt story, it makes Fav Bow just a worse weapon to see on a banner. Like you'd want to use it on Diona, maybe on Yelan, on Goro, on Farazan, but like on Diona, it's not necessary. And then both Farazan and Goro's kind of dog shit. Farazan's pretty situational. So really, it's kind of just a Yelan weapon, sometimes Ororon. And then Claymores, oh boy. I don't think there is a good Claymore character that wants Fav. Maybe next patch with Aino, it'll be fine, but meh. And then we compare that to the polearm and sword users, right? Sword users, Singso, Kazuha, Lila if you want to shield her, Farina, Dahlia. There's other characters that use it, right? Kaya, Jean, Lynette, but they're generally not strong enough to matter that much, so. And then for polearm characters, it's even worse, right? Shenling, Rosaria, Candace, Shenhe, Zhongli, Yao Yao, Mika, Chevaliers, Kachina, Yonsan, Escoffier, Inefa. It's, dude, you need so many Fav Lances, man. So both Fav Sword and Fav Lance you're pretty happy to see them. Overall, I'd say that this is definitely a much better than average banner. The biggest problem is that both Chasca's Sig and Mualani's Sig are kind of carry exclusive weapons. They're not good stat stakes on characters like Fischl that just do off-field damage, but they are quite good on the characters that use them. And then you have a pretty powerful 4-star lineup as well. Generally, I'd say that if you're trying to go for vertical investment on either Chasca or Mualani. I'd probably favor getting the Sig a little bit more than getting early cons, but a pretty significant contributing factor to that is the presence of these broken ass Fav weapons. And if you already have enough Fav lances and Fav swords, then maybe you're better off going for the cons instead. But yeah, that's gonna be it for the banner review. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a thing or two. I'm kind of getting baited. My EU account is progressing well right now, but I still don't have Bennett. I actually don't have any of these 3 characters, so for IT, this would be nice, but also just getting Bennett is kind of important. So I might get baited into going on this banner, but I hope I don't get Mualani because I don't really want her on that account. Anyways, hope you enjoyed, hope you learned a thing or two, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.